The records of the 3rd Reconnaissance Detachment note little about Private Elijah Creed beyond his enlistment date, marksmanship certification, and assignment as an auxiliary scout under French command. His name appears in margins rather than headings, an administrative oversight that mirrored his quiet passage through the winter-threatened camps of the Vosges region. Yet among the soldiers who marched those corridors of fog and timber, he was the only one who seemed to observe the forest with the patience of someone reading a document rather than a landscape. The detachment had entered its 3rd week of patrol losses by the time the senior officers began to acknowledge a pattern. Men sent ahead on routine route checks were found collapsed in snow or at the base of pines, their wounds narrow and precise, delivered from distances that exceeded the capability of typical field rifles of the period. With no clear vantage points and no witness accounts, the regiment attributed the attacks to an unseen group of German sharpshooters operating in terrain unfamiliar to French mapping teams. Elijah, however, spent more time studying the margins of the woods than the expected paths. He moved carefully, eyes tracking faint breaks in frost or unnatural alignments of bark. 19th-century scouts were trained to look for spoor, track imprints, and smoke traces, yet the Vosges winter erased such evidence with meticulous efficiency. Snow fell in thin curtains, smoothing out depressions within minutes. Ice formed on branches and cracked unpredictably, producing sounds that masked human movement. Visibility, under a sun clouded by constant mist, rarely extended beyond 30 or 40 paces. Creed compensated by relying on subtler cues. Repeated markings on the bases of fir trees, persistent silences in certain sections of forest, and a faint, metallic tang in the air that suggested weapon maintenance nearby. Still, his observations went largely unacknowledged. To the rest of the detachment, he remained the quiet auxiliary, a man assigned, not requested, whose skill with a rifle was appreciated but seldom consulted. What unsettled the regiment more than the losses was the distance at which the attacks seemed to originate. Without optical scopes, 19th-century sharpshooters depended on physical elevation or clear lines of sight, yet none of the surrounding ridges offered the necessary height. Patrols tasked with sweeping the forest found no platforms, no overlook points, and no footprints leading to or from plausible firing positions. This absence of trace fed an atmosphere of quiet dread that settled into the ranks like a second winter. On the morning that changed the detachment's assumptions, Elijah paused near a cluster of dead trees leaning at identical angles, their bark unnaturally smooth around the upper trunks. The forest was still. Even the usual crack of frost shifting in branches had ceased. He noted that the snow beneath the trees remained undisturbed, yet the trunks bore faint vertical seams, as though something within them expanded and contracted with the cold. He exhaled slowly, testing the air. A distant sound, too sharp to be ice-breaking, echoed faintly between the trees. He turned his head slightly, narrowing his eyes at a hollow stump that seemed to tilt a fraction against the wind rather than with it. Before he could investigate further, a sudden crack split the silence. The bullet passed his face so closely that its wake stung his cheek. It embedded itself in the snowbank behind him without so much as a ricochet. The shot had not been exploratory. It had been precise, measured, calculated, and unmistakably personal. Somewhere among the dead trees, something had just taken aim again. The patrol withdrew Elijah from the exposed clearing only after the snow concealed the bullet's entry point behind him. The officers marked the incident as another unexplained long-range threat, noting in their brief report that no viable approach vectors could be determined. The absence of tracks, prints, or disturbed foliage continued to confound the detachment, and morning formations grew increasingly tense as men whispered about riflemen who seemed to appear and vanish like phantoms. Elijah returned to the site under the pretext of confirming distances. He moved quietly, following the faint curvature of the forest floor where earlier patrols had fallen. Snow had gathered heavily during the night, smoothing all indentations, yet even freshly fallen layers revealed inconsistencies, patterns that did not align with natural drifts. Snow near the kill sites bore subtle compressions without defined boot outlines, as though pressure had been applied from above rather than from ground level. The officers dismissed these details as the effects of wind eddies common in winter forests. Elijah found the explanation insufficient. He examined the broken branches overhead. Many fractures were angled downward from heights unreachable by a standing rifleman, and the splintering showed no signs of weight-bearing ascent or descent. Traditional field tracking manuals of the late 19th century emphasized ground-level disturbances, soil displacement, heel pivots, stray fibers caught on bark, but none applied cleanly here. The forest canopy itself seemed to show signs of intrusion, though without visible contact marks from climbing equipment or rope. The detachment's senior lieutenant insisted that hidden ground nests were the only logical explanation. Yet Elijah noted that the fallen soldiers had been struck from angles inconsistent with low firing positions. He kneeled near a cluster of frozen stones, running his gloved hand lightly across their surfaces. On several, he detected faint, concentric scuff marks, so slight they resembled imperfections in the rock rather than evidence of use. But their placement was consistent, spaced along a line of boulders overlooking a shallow depression. He tapped one of the marks gently with a piece of broken branch. A muted resonance traveled through the stone, a vibration that returned to him in a low, delayed hum. It was not a natural echo. It suggested redirection of sound, as though the boulders were being used to scatter or absorb noise from an elevated firing point. This technique, though primitive by modern standards, aligned with period accounts of sharpshooters exploiting natural acoustics to mask rifle reports. The regiment, however, remained anchored to its assumptions. The officers recorded Elijah's observations as non-standard impressions influenced by stress. Attempts to raise the possibility of elevated firing positions were dismissed on the grounds that no platforms, ladders, or visible structures existed. Elijah did not argue. He simply continued to walk the perimeter, tracing a widening circle of irregularities. As he advanced deeper into the tree line, he noticed a freshly snapped branch lying in the snow. Its breakpoint was nearly 6 meters above the ground. No prints lay beneath it. No bark fragments indicated climbing. And yet the fracture was recent, the wood still pale and moist inside. He followed the line of trees upward, studying the canopy. A thin corridor ran between fir crowns where snow failed to collect, as if something or someone moved along those high paths, careful enough to leave no trace on the forest floor. A gust of wind swept through, carrying with it a faint metallic clink. It came not from the ground, but from somewhere above the treetops, sharp, measured, and unmistakably artificial. Elijah froze, scanning the branches. There was nothing to be seen, only fog drifting between skeletal silhouettes of winter trees. Yet the sound had been real, and whoever made it was watching. Elijah settled on a narrow ridge overlooking the frozen valley below. His hands, gloved in worn leather, clutched a battered tin cup salvaged from the regiment's meager provisions. It had dents along its rim, a thin layer of frost on its surface, and the faint scent of scorched coffee inside. Yet to Elijah, it was no longer a vessel for drink. It had become a tool of investigation. He lifted the cup to his lips and spoke softly, testing vowels and consonants against the ridge's edge. The Vosges winter forests were notorious for distorting sound. Snow muffled some echoes, ice-coated rocks refracted others, and narrow hollows between firs acted as primitive acoustic lenses. Scouts had long relied on intuition and observation to estimate distances, but Elijah sought something deliberate, quantifiable reverberations that could reveal unseen positions. A low hum from his own breath vibrated against the tin. He rotated it, cupped one hand around the rim, and struck it gently with a twig. A hollow metallic ping resonated, traveling down the slope. The sound bounced off a cluster of hollowed trees and fractured boulders, returning to him in staggered intervals. He measured the delay by counting heartbeats, a rudimentary chronometer but sufficient for his purposes. Certain pitches returned clearer, sharper, suggesting cavities or hollows capable of amplifying noise. He adjusted the angle of his strike, observing how the echo shifted depending on elevation and orientation. Snow-laden branches filtered higher frequencies, while the low thrum of the tin cup carried farther. Patterns emerged. A small concavity within a distant tree trunk produced a distinct return. Another hollowed boulder altered the tone's pitch. By systematically probing the terrain with sound, Elijah began mentally mapping potential sniper positions that remained invisible to the eye. He documented each observation meticulously in his notebook, sketching rough diagrams of ridge contours, tree clusters, and rock formations. The procedure was methodical: strike, observe, measure, record, repeat. Over hours, he discovered that combinations of hollows produced echoes that could betray the presence of a marksman hiding within. In effect, the forest itself could be interrogated through sound. Yet the most troubling moment arrived mid-morning. After testing a sequence of taps, Elijah paused to listen. He had struck the cup sharply against the frozen soil and expected a faint return from the ridge hollow directly opposite. Instead, a crisp, definitive echo reached him, sharper, more deliberate, and rhythmically matching his own strikes. It was no natural reflection. The forest had not generated it. Someone had. His pulse quickened. He dropped the tin cup into the snow and crouched, scanning the opposite ridge with cold, disciplined eyes. The hollow spaces between firs and boulders appeared undisturbed. No telltale movement, no glint of metal, no shifting shadow. Yet the sound was real, immediate, and undeniably mimicked. "Elijah, someone just copied you," he murmured under his breath, the words swallowed by the forest's muted stillness. The implications were immediate and chilling. If the Germans had discovered his method, if even one marksman could replicate the sound mapping he had devised, they could anticipate every movement, turn, and approach, using the echoes of his own experiment against him. He considered the ramifications. The uncanny resonance that had revealed hollows could now expose him to counter-surveillance. His scientific curiosity, so far a tool of insight, had transformed into a source of vulnerability. The forest, which had seemed a passive participant, now held a silent, active observer, someone listening, learning, waiting. Elijah pressed his gloved hands against the snow, flattening himself to the ridge. The wind shifted, carrying only the distant sound of falling ice and the hushed rustle of winter pines. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a presence acknowledged him, not in sight, but in precise, echoing mimicry. He exhaled slowly, recalibrating his resolve. The tin cup trick had worked, but now it had a rival. The game of echoes had begun. Elijah adjusted his position along the ridge, crouching low beneath a sprawl of frost-laden firs. His tin cup, dented and frosted, rested in gloved hands. A soft tap against the hardened soil sent a crisp ping echoing across the valley. He closed his eyes for a heartbeat, counting the intervals until the response returned. The echo was faint but distinct, guiding him toward a subtle depression in the snow, an irregularity that betrayed a hollow beneath a gnarled pine stump. Winter in the Vosges was merciless. Snow-crusted brittle branches, and each footstep risked cracking ice-laden twigs that could betray a scout. Elijah's regiment had long relied on instinctive tracking, yet the precision required to locate concealed snipers in this terrain surpassed conventional observation. Every sound, every reflection, had to be interpreted carefully. The tin cup had become his analytical instrument, translating the forest's acoustics into actionable intelligence. He inched forward, following the sound's origin, noting how the slope and tree clusters bent the echoes. The pine stump loomed ahead, inconspicuous except for a slight hollow at its base. As he approached, he observed the subtle indicators of occupation: disturbed needles, faint soot inside the cavity, and a patch of compressed earth that had deflected the snow. The forest itself seemed to lean in, silent witness to his investigation. Peering into the hollow, Elijah's breath caught. Inside lay the body of a German sharpshooter, face frozen in mid-expression. Frost had glazed his uniform and equipment, evidence that he had succumbed to exposure before moving from this concealed position. The sniper's rifle rested across his knees, barrel pointed slightly upward, and crude padding insulated the wooden stock. Improvised camouflage, pine boughs, mud, and cloth clung to the stump's exterior. The position had been efficient, well thought out, yet insufficient against the Vosges winter. Elijah cataloged the details in his mind and scribbled brief notes in his pocket notebook. The discovery was as informative as it was sobering. The enemy rotated snipers systematically. The abandoned nest confirmed a disciplined schedule that relied on minimal time spent in exposed positions. Each site, no matter how well concealed, left traces, compressed earth, shifted debris, faint echoes that a methodical observer could interpret. His hand lingered on a small device clutched by the dead sniper, a rangefinder of advanced design, measuring distances with a precision Elijah had not encountered in standard-issue German equipment of the era. The metal, etched with fine calibrations, suggested recent innovations, technology perhaps intended to outmatch French scouts in precision targeting. Its presence was unsettling, a sign that the enemy had access to tools beyond conventional doctrine. Elijah closed the tin cup and set it aside, scanning the surrounding forest. If this nest had been abandoned, other snipers were likely active elsewhere, concealed in hollows, tree cavities, or improvised platforms. Each echo, each disturbance, was a silent testimony to their presence. The Vosges had become a web of hidden threats, and this single discovery was merely the first revelation. The crisp wind carried the faint creak of distant timber and the occasional clatter of loose ice. Elijah noted the shadows cast across the snow, patterns that might conceal further nests. His mind raced through calculations, angles, distances, echo trajectories. The forest had whispered its secret, and he had listened carefully. Yet the dead German's grip on the unexpected rangefinder left him with an unnerving thought. If this one was abandoned, where were the others? And what unseen technology awaited him in the depths of the winter woods? Night settled over the Vosges with a cold, unforgiving finality. The forest, draped in a veil of frost and mist, seemed to swallow sound. Yet Elijah's senses were attuned to even the faintest vibrations. The tin cup rested lightly in his hands, ready to capture the faintest echo. Each tap against the hard, frozen earth, each metallic clink against a tree, returned a pattern of sound that he could interpret. The overlapping bounces, subtle distortions, and unexpected delays became his map, an auditory sketch of the hidden enemy. The forest whispered in fractured pitches. One note rebounded sharply from a hollowed stump. Another returned muffled and elongated from a rocky outcrop. Each echo suggested a separate cavity, a distinct nest. Elijah moved carefully between trees, counting the time intervals, noting the angles of return, and marking his leather-bound field notebook with crude triangulations. The method was painstaking, a slow weave of observation and deduction. Yet, each step brought clarity. The forest was not silent, but it spoke only to those who listened. Frost crunched beneath his boots, ice crackling on branches above. The wind shifted unpredictably, bending sound waves, sometimes amplifying, sometimes muting them. Distances that seemed short could extend, and echoes could mingle, forming auditory illusions. Elijah had learned to discount the anomalies, cross-referencing repeated signals and factoring in slope, elevation, and forest density. By combining careful measurement with mental mapping, he began to see a pattern emerge. On a piece of cloth, stretched across his lap, he sketched the forest outline, marking approximate positions with small excess. Each mark represented a potential sniper's nest, 7 in total, arranged in a subtle semicircle. He traced the imaginary lines toward the east, where the regiment's morning march would likely proceed. The realization chilled him. This was no haphazard placement. The enemy had designed a coordinated trap, each nest calculated to intersect fields of fire across the expected approach path. Elijah's breath fogged in the frigid air as he crouched, listening to the distorted whispers of sound that carried through the timberline. Snowflakes drifted past, falling silently, but the wind carried the metallic clinks of distant frost, reminders that the forest itself could mask or exaggerate danger. Each nest's position suggested careful planning, reinforced with subtle camouflage and natural barriers, hollow stumps, rock outcrops, overhanging limbs. The combination created overlapping zones of fire, which would be lethal if the regiment advanced unprepared. He noted the small but crucial acoustic signatures of each site, the hollow tones of a wooden enclosure, the faint scraping of a metal rangefinder, the echo from snow-crusted branches disturbed by prior activity. Each sound became a coordinate in his mind, every minute difference a clue. By carefully timing his taps and noting the return, Elijah could project the three-dimensional layout of the hidden German positions. The final mark was made with deliberate emphasis. The semicircle now complete, he traced it with his gloved finger toward the main path where his unit would march at first light. His stomach tightened. The regiment's route intersected directly with the web of hidden rifles. 7 nests, arranged with cold precision, were poised to deliver simultaneous crossfire. Elijah lowered the tin cup, staring across the forest floor. The whispers of the frozen timberline had revealed their secret, and the regiment's fate, for the moment, rested entirely on his recognition of the invisible threat. The forest, silent to all but the listening, had spoken, and what it revealed was deadly. The morning march would follow the very line his map now indicated. Every step risked exposing men to the unseen German marksmen concealed in the icy shadows. Dawn crept over the Vosges ridges, staining the frost-covered pines with pale light. Snow crunched under boots as the regiment began its morning march, columned in measured intervals. Elijah moved at the rear, eyes scanning every crest and hollow, ears attuned to the forest's latent whispers. Each footfall carried the regiment closer to the trap he had uncovered, yet the officers remained unconvinced. He had spent the night pleading, demonstrating patterns with his battered tin cup, but discipline and skepticism outweighed concern. The forest was cold, indifferent, yet it spoke to him in subtle pulses. Frost-laden branches hung low, and every hollow in the timberline reflected sound differently. Elijah's hands, gloved and steady despite the biting air, held the tin cup lightly. At carefully measured intervals, he tapped it against his knee. Short, deliberate metallic clinks. The rhythm carried across the snow, bouncing off ridges and hollowed trunks, and he listened intently for responses that might betray hidden positions. The officers murmured among themselves, doubt shadowing their features. They could not see what Elijah had triangulated, could not perceive the geometry of concealed nests poised above the trail. And yet, the forest responded. From the east, a faint repetition of his pattern returned, then another from the northwest, and a third from a hollow pine farther along the slope. The echoes were subtle but unmistakable, for nests answered his rhythm, as if confirming his calculations. Elijah's pulse quickened. He noted the precise intervals of each response, the tonal variations revealing the materials shielding the snipers: wood, bark, and frozen earth. He scribbled positions onto a small map tucked inside his coat, the frost stiffening his fingers. Each echo validated his theory. These were no random positions. The Germans had orchestrated a semicircle of overlapping fire, preying on the regiment's expected path. Yet not all nests replied. 3 points remained silent, the absence of echo amplifying the menace. Silent but lethal, they waited in anticipation. Elijah understood the risk. Even with 4 nests identified, the unknown remained deadly. He moved closer to the officers, gesturing subtly toward the distant tree line, trying to indicate the threat without disrupting the march's discipline. Snow swirled around their boots, stirred by the wind, masking minor movements but also muffling distant sounds. The regiment's formation, standard for winter patrols, relied on spacing that could minimize exposure, but only if the elevated threats were known. Communication was constrained. No radios existed, only signals, runners, and shouted orders. Any warning had to be concise, precise, and actionable. The march continued, slow and deliberate, each man immersed in the routine of heavy packs, rifles slung, breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Every echo, every clink of the tin cup, was a line of intelligence in Elijah's mind, weaving a map of hidden threats. The frozen forest seemed to watch silently, anticipating, poised. For nests had answered his rhythm, proof that the threat was real, but 3 remained silent. Somewhere in the timberline, unseen enemies waited, shadows blending with frost and mist. Elijah's eyes narrowed on the silent hollows, realizing that the regiment's fate teetered on the edge of sound and silence, and that a single misstep could awaken the waiting killers. The Vosges morning was brittle with cold. Frost crystallized on every pine needle, and the snow reflected an unforgiving gray light. Elijah crouched near a frozen creek, his tin cup stowed, hands braced against the icy soil. The forest held a profound stillness, the usual creaks of timber and the whispers of wind muted by winter's weight. And in that silence, he listened. The 4 nests had responded to his rhythm yesterday, revealing their locations with echoes he could trace across ridges and hollows. But the remaining 3 had been silent. That very silence now became the instrument of detection. Elijah understood that absence could speak as loudly as presence. Where the sound failed to return, an obstruction, a cavity, or a hidden nest might exist. He tapped lightly on his cup against a rock, sharp but subtle. Each note propagated through the snow and timber. The response, or lack thereof, was telling. Some frequencies bounced back normally. Others returned diminished or delayed. He observed the changes, the slight variations caused by ice pockets beneath shallow soil, frozen hollows along the creek, and buried root cavities. By recording which notes failed to return where they should, Elijah began to sketch a map of anomalies, voids within the forest where sound behaved unnaturally. Slowly, a pattern emerged. The delayed echoes indicated hollows artificially enhanced by human positioning, small platforms, hollowed-out branches, and snow-covered ledges. These anomalies were concentrated along a line above the visible tree line, where the ground seemed to slope but actually yielded a higher elevation than any natural ridge in the area. Elijah crouched, tracing the mental grid. The silent nests, he now identified them not by echo, but by echo's absence, were precisely arranged, their positions forming a final crossfire triangle. Standard scouting methods could not have revealed them. No footprints, no snapped branches, no scent trails. Only careful auditory triangulation, meticulous observation, and the cold mathematics of negative space exposed their presence. The regiment remained unaware. Officers scanned the forest for movement, seeing nothing but mist and frost. Elijah's map, annotated with small, excess, and precise distances measured by pacing and observation, revealed the impossible. 3 snipers positioned on overhangs, far above the natural line of approach, suspended as if by illusion. He checked his calculations repeatedly. Ice pockets and snow drifts could not explain it. There had to be some structure, crude scaffolding, possibly camouflaged by winter white. Yet the climb required would have been nearly impossible to execute in a single night. He whispered to the officer at his side, pointing toward the faint outline of the upper tree line. "Sir, they're above the ridge," he said, voice low. "But there's no ridge up there." The man's eyes narrowed, scanning snow and fog. No topographical anomaly was visible. Yet Elijah's observations were exact. The silence itself had betrayed the hidden positions. The wind shifted, stirring frost along the branches. A distant pine creaked under its own weight, and the forest seemed to exhale. Every step the regiment would take toward the concealed positions carried latent peril. Elijah's mind raced with calculations, distances, firing angles, and the precarious stability of improvised platforms that could collapse under weight. The stakes were immediate, and the margin for error infinitesimal. The 3 remaining nests, revealed not by sound, but by the absence of it, perched in impossible positions. Elijah's realization was stark. Either the sharpshooters had engineered a way to access the heights overnight, or the forest itself concealed secrets the regiment could scarcely imagine. The next move would require precision, nerve, and an understanding of silence as deadly as any rifle. Night had thickened into a near impenetrable black, and the forest of the Vosges lay under a veil of frost and mist. Elijah moved silently along the ridge base, his boots crunching only minimally on frozen needles and packed snow. Every inhalation puffed in short clouds that vanished almost immediately, and each step required careful placement, lest the ice-laden undergrowth betray him. He carried no lantern. The faint light of stars reflected off the snow, casting dim, high-contrast silhouettes over the treetops. For hours, he had tracked the subtle distortions in echo. Each tap of his tin cup had hinted at a higher origin, an anomaly above the visible tree line. The forest's acoustics were peculiar here. Hollow fir trunks amplified certain frequencies, while deep snow absorbed others. Following these irregularities, Elijah pressed upward, using branches and natural outcroppings as holds. He felt the rope he had brought, a narrow, coiled hemp line, drag along the fir needles, testing its friction against frozen bark before throwing it over a sturdy limb. The rope swayed slightly, like a pendulum frozen in time, threatening to betray his presence with the slightest misstep. He climbed carefully, balancing on saplings that groaned under his weight. Above, he could hear the faint hum of wind passing through the upper boughs. It masked his approach, but only just. Then, through the dense black, he glimpsed a faint rectangular outline between the firs, a platform, elevated and suspended, anchored by taut ropes looped over heavy limbs. Black and white shadows painted the structure as a ghostly silhouette against the moonlit sky. No natural ridge supported it. It hung, as if stitched between the trees. Elijah inched closer, noting the craftsmanship. The platform was simple but effective. Planks reinforced with rope lashings, held fast by multiple anchors. Evidence suggested careful calculation. Rope knots typical of frontier scouts, cross braces to prevent sway, and padding to dampen any movement. The Germans had anchored it with precision, creating a vantage that conventional observation could never detect. His pulse quickened. The placement accounted for angles, firing lines, and maximum visibility over the valley below. From the concealed shadows of the firs, he heard voices. 3 German sharpshooters were on the platform, discussing in hushed tones the upcoming sunrise operation. By dawn, they'll be marked, one said, voice low and deliberate. All movements catalogued. Nothing will survive. The words confirmed Elijah's worst suspicions. These positions had been prepared for a coordinated strike, their semicircular crossfire already aimed at the unsuspecting regiment. He noted their equipment quickly: short-range binoculars, powder flasks, and a measuring device, probably a compact rangefinder used to calculate trajectory over snow-covered terrain. His mind catalogued each detail, but caution governed every muscle. One misstep, one creaking board, could alert them, and the consequences would be immediate and lethal. A dry snap echoed faintly behind him. Elijah froze. The sound was small, a breaking twig or a frost-laden branch, but it cut through the night with piercing clarity. His body stiffened, senses sharpened. Somewhere in the blackness behind him, the forest had begun to respond, warning him that solitude on this vertical ascent carried risk. Elijah's eyes darted back over his shoulder. The suspended platform above held the 3 sharpshooters ready for dawn, their conversation betraying precise plans for crossfire. And now, a branch behind him had cracked. He was no longer alone in the silence. The forest's black and white shadow had shifted. Elijah's breath came shallow and rapid as he froze behind a thick fir, the distant whisper of rope sway from the suspended platform above still ringing in his ears. The metallic clink of his tin cup had not gone unnoticed. From the darkness above, a sharp report punctuated the night, bullets striking bark and snow-laden branches with brittle certainty. He had been discovered, but the Germans had no clear line of sight. Every heartbeat measured the distance between him and death. He crouched low, scanning the black and white outlines of the forest. Moonlight glinted off ice-encrusted branches and the reflective surface of his tin cup. A plan formed as instinct overtook fear. The cup itself would become a tool of misdirection. He pressed the rim against the rough trunk of a nearby tree and released it. It struck with a hollow metallic note, bouncing once, twice, then echoing along the ridges. The sound carried upward, seeming to originate from a place he was not. The Germans reacted instantly. Gunfire erupted toward the phantom source, snow spraying around invisible trees, bark splintering. Elijah pressed against the cold earth, rolling silently down the slope, using fallen logs as cover. His descent led him to a ravine choked with frost-bitten boulders and brittle undergrowth. Each step required calculation. One misjudged branch could snap and betray him. He used small handholds along icy rocks and let gravity guide him, conserving energy while avoiding direct confrontation. The forest itself seemed to conspire in his favor. Snow muffled his movement, while the echoes of gunfire and metallic clinks masked the sound of his retreat. His fingers were numb against the rope and frozen rocks, and his boots slipped occasionally on glazed slopes. But the rhythm of flight carried him safely downward. His mind catalogued every detail: how echoes bounced along the hollow trunks, how snow shelves altered perception of sound, how pursuit could be guided away from actual positions. Reaching the base of the ravine, Elijah paused, heart hammering, breath forming white clouds that drifted toward the shadowed cliff walls. The night was alive with distant replies of gunfire ricocheting through the terrain. It was in this tenuous silence that he observed something more, for subtle indentations beneath overhanging snow shelves. The forest concealed them carefully. Low ridges, ice-laden rocks, and deep snow created hidden cavities. Through careful inspection, he recognized the faint outlines of rifle muzzles and the depressions of footprints, a series of sniper nests, distinct from those already mapped. Elijah crouched low, tracing the shadowed shapes with eyes trained to detect unnatural lines against snow and rock. The realization struck with clinical precision. 7 nests above had been joined by 4 more below, bringing the total threat to 14 sharpshooters. Each position was deliberate, offering overlapping fields of fire and a near-perfect trap along the regiment's intended route. Despite injury to his ankle from a misstep earlier, he shifted position cautiously. Every sound, his own or the forest's, was now part of a calculated system. The regiment's march would begin within 3 hours. The echo trick he had employed to escape had also given him time to observe the scale of the danger below. Silence was now both shield and intelligence. Elijah's eyes swept the frozen forest floor once more. For additional nests, buried beneath snow and ice, had gone unnoticed by the regiment. The trap was far more extensive than anyone realized. In less than 3 hours, the unsuspecting men would march directly into a web of precise, deadly fire, unless he acted. The tin cup remained in his hand, small, battered, and yet more powerful than any rifle in the forest that night. Dawn crept through the skeletal firs, pale gray light glinting off frost-coated branches. Elijah crouched at the forest's edge, tin cup in hand, while a small detachment of officers followed silently behind, maps and field notebooks clutched tightly. The regiment had been skeptical, their earlier dismissals still lingering in the air, but the weight of 14 potential sniper nests required demonstration, not argument. Elijah tapped the cup lightly against a hollowed log. The sound traveled along frozen trunks and rock, bouncing back in irregular patterns. The first echo returned from the platform above the clouds, confirming his prior observation. The officer's eyes widened as he marked its position on a crude topographical map. Each successive tap revealed another nest. The hollow stump, the semicircular formations along the ridge, the hidden ice pockets below. One by one, the tin cup echo returned signals from every concealed position. He instructed the officers to note the angle, distance, and pitch. "Listen to the differences," he said, his voice calm, measured. "Each echo is distinct. Each represents a potential threat if we proceed unaware." They moved systematically, tapping along lines and tracing the forest contours. Frost sparkled in the low light, and the silhouettes of men hunched over maps and notebooks were stark against blackened timber. The sound of bouncing metal became a language of survival. Officers recorded every return, correlating pitch variations to the locations he had previously charted. By mid-morning, all 14 nests had been confirmed, each one representing a potential sniper's field of fire that could have devastated the regiment's march. The gravity of Elijah's demonstration settled over the group. The forest, once perceived as a neutral expanse of timber and snow, now appeared as a meticulously organized web of danger. The officers realized the precision with which the Germans had placed these positions, exploiting terrain, ice pockets, and natural echoes to coordinate ambushes. Preemptive counterfire is possible, Elijah noted, tracing lines across his map that connected each nest with the regiment's projected movement. Using early triangulation methods and rudimentary artillery coordination, the officers began to plan a targeted barrage that would neutralize the nests before troops entered the kill zone. Communication remained verbal and visual. No radios were present. Messengers would carry maps and instructions, while prearranged signals would coordinate the limited field artillery. As the officers conferred, Elijah tapped the tin cup once more to confirm a distant nest near the northern ice shelf. The echo returned as expected, but then a second echo followed immediately after, sharper than the first, and one he had not produced. He froze. The metallic sound resonated along a ridge where no confirmed nest existed. The officers, unaware, continued charting positions and discussing firing sequences. Elijah's mind raced. Someone skilled enough to replicate the precise tin cup rhythm, was in the forest again. Not a mistake, not a misinterpretation. The echo had intentional timing, a mimic of his own signal, but originating from a point he had not marked. The frost-laden air seemed to tighten around him. Every movement, every note of the tin cup's bounce suddenly carried the weight of unknown observers. The regiment's safety depended on neutralizing known threats, but an unseen entity, Repeating his methodology introduced an unpredictable variable. Elijah lowered the cup slowly, eyes scanning the mist-laden timber. The forest was no longer just 14 nests. It was 15, perhaps more. The sound of the echo that wasn't his own lingered in the cold air, a deliberate signal from a phantom sharpshooter who had been copying him all along. Someone out there, he murmured to himself, is copying me again. The forest lay quiet, brittle with frost, yet every snap of a branch or shift of ice seemed amplified in Elijah's ears. He crouched behind a fallen trunk, tin cup at the ready, replaying the morning's anomalous echo in his mind. 14 nests had been verified, positions marked, danger assessed, but the 15th echo remained an enigma. It was not merely distant or faint. It carried an unnatural clarity, a sharpness that human lips or timber could not produce. Elijah struck the tin cup lightly, listening intently. The echo returned almost instantaneously, perfectly timed, its metallic ring unlike the hollow timber or snow-encased hollows he had mapped before. His fingers traced the rim of the cup, noting the difference in frequency, pitch, and reverberation. It was deliberate, engineered. Using early principles of acoustic reflection, Elijah analyzed the trajectory of the sound. The echo was not originating from a natural hollow or tree cavity. It came from a single point elevated above the usual lines of sight, directed toward the regiment's projected approach. It was a lure, a mechanism to draw the soldiers unknowingly into crossfire. He crouched, examining the terrain, and spotted it, a thin metal plate wedged against a fir trunk, angled with precision to catch and amplify sound. Sunlight glinted off its frost-coated surface, making it almost invisible against the black and white timber background. A shiver ran down his spine. This was not a standard field device. It was a calculated acoustic trap, the first of its kind he had seen outside manuals or theoretical diagrams. Elijah knelt and measured the angles mentally, calculating how sound waves would bounce from the plate toward the expected troop path. Every tap of the cup sent vibrations toward it, and every return confirmed its location. The Germans had deliberately installed this plate to produce the final, unervingly precise echo. Its purpose was clear. Any officer attempting to investigate the sound might trigger the full defensive coordination of the 14 hidden nests simultaneously. The implications were immediate. Destroying the plate would neutralize the artificial lure, but the act could simultaneously reveal Elijah's awareness of the nests to the enemy. A single misstep and the regiment would face a fully prepared, pre-sighted field of sharpshooters. The trap was elegant and deadly in its simplicity, an acoustic tripwire for a dozen trained marksmen hidden among frost-laden timber and snow. Elijah's breath puffed in small clouds in the cold morning air as he observed the subtle lines of frost, branches, and rock. Each factor played into the echo's effectiveness. Winter's snow, the hollows in felled trunks, the distance between tree trunks, all combined to carry sound in ways only he, through observation and trial, could interpret. Despite the danger, he began plotting a careful route, mental calculations racing. Approach silently, neutralize the metal plate, avoid disturbing the snow or underbrush that could betray his presence. Every footfall would have to be measured, each movement precise. A misstep would not only compromise the regiment, but potentially expose him to lethal counterfire. Elijah's mind ran through contingencies. Could he use a small stone to dislodge it from a distance? Would a branch snap unexpectedly? Could the vibrations alone alert the hidden marksman? Each scenario had a probability he calculated instinctively, balancing the risks with the imperative to protect his comrades. Finally, he made his decision. The forest seemed to lean closer, shadows lengthening along the frost-bound timber, the black and white silhouette of the landscape eerily still. He whispered to himself, almost ritualistically, as if acknowledging the magnitude of the action. If I destroy this, all 14 nests will know we are aware. And yet, leaving it intact ensures they decide who dies today. The risk was clear, and the choice inevitable. Elijah slung his pack tighter, gripped the tin cup, and prepared for the climb toward the metal plate. Alone, the wind whispered through the branches as he stepped forward, realizing that the destruction of this single engineered echo could simultaneously expose every hidden sharpshooter in the forest. The ridge loomed above, a black and white silhouette etched against the cold dawn. Frost clung to every branch, turning the forest into a spectral lattice of gray and white. Elijah Creed, tin cup in hand, crouched low beneath the overhanging firs, eyes scanning the faint metal glint of the German echo plate. Every breath seemed magnified in the still air. The slightest sound could betray him. Below, the regiment began its cautious advance, unaware that 14 sharpshooters were poised, hidden in the timberline, to transform the march into a slaughter. Elijah's mind raced through every calculation: distances, angles, bullet trajectories, and the subtle scattering of sound through the dense, frost-covered forest. Each sniper nest had been mapped through echoes, triangulated, studied, but the final plate remained an unknown variable. He struck the tin cup once, the sharp metallic note bouncing up the ridge. Immediately, a volley of rifle fire cracked through the morning fog, the snipers reacting to the echo rather than his presence. The sound carried precisely as he intended, each man misled by the false reverberation, their aim drawn toward a phantom target. Elijah seized the moment. Moving with deliberate precision, he ascended the steep incline, using boulders and frost-laden roots as footholds. Rifle fire whipped past, snapping branches and churning snow into a cloud of gray dust. The wind carried the metallic tang of gunfire and the faint scent of gunpowder. Yet the echoes from his tin cup misdirected the hidden marksman, giving him a narrow corridor to the plate. At last, he reached it, a thin sheet of polished metal, angled to replicate any sound the forest produced. With a swift motion, he smashed it against a rock. The sharp clang reverberated, followed by silence as the metallic trap lay destroyed. Simultaneously, signals passed through the regiment, prearranged. Artillery fire and coordinated volleys erupted, striking precisely at the 14 known nest locations. Snow, timber, and frost exploded in showers of debris. The snipers, taken by surprise, fell one by one. Elijah crouched, observing the carefully timed destruction, noting each nest neutralized. His training, observation, and the improvised acoustic method he had pioneered had worked. The forest, once a web of unseen danger, now lay quiet, the morning light glinting off abandoned rifles and broken treetop platforms. Breathing heavily, Elijah allowed himself a brief glance back. The regiment had survived what would have been a massacre. Officers approached, eyes wide with recognition and disbelief. They had underestimated him, overlooked his quiet demeanor, dismissed his methods. But now, faced with the complete neutralization of a highly organized enemy system, they could no longer. Echoes speak for those who listen, Elijah said softly, almost to himself. No further explanation was needed. His ingenuity had been silent, precise, and decisive. As he stepped back, his tin cup slipped from his gloved hand. It tumbled down the slope, dented and scuffed, rolling across frost and rock until it came to a stop in a small hollow. For a moment, it seemed to whisper one last note, faint and hollow, as if echoing the victories and fears of the forest. Then it fell silent. The black and white timberline stretched beyond him, now quiet except for the distant sigh of wind through branches. The Vosges forest had witnessed both ingenuity and peril, and now, for a moment, peace returned. Not loud, not celebrated, but observed in the hush of snow, frost, and frozen echoes. The tin cup lay broken, yet in its silence, it retained a faint echo, a subtle reminder that observation, ingenuity, and courage could speak long after the sound had ended. Elijah turned toward the regiment, stepping lightly, leaving the forest to its quiet, spectral stillness. Somewhere down the slope, the tin cup's faint echo lingered, an imperceptible murmur against the vast silence, hinting that the forest remembered every secret, every mark, every whisper of ingenuity.